The earliest records show that enslaved Africans were brought to New Amsterdam by the Dutch West India Company in the 1620s. Some accounts point to small groups arriving as early as 1624, while more detailed records identify August 29, 1627, when the ship Brindvish carried a group of Africans to Manhattan. The land was controlled by the Dutch West India Company. This company did not exist to build homes or towns. It existed to make money for investors. It traded in fur, land, and labor. At first, the company struggled. The colony was small, the winters were harsh, workers were few. Native trade was not enough, so the company looked elsewhere. In 1626, a ship arrived in Manhattan. It carried 11 African men. They were not free, they were owned. This moment changed everything. At first, these men were called company slaves. They were owned by the Dutch West India Company. They worked where needed. They cleared forests, they built roads, they raised walls, they drained swamps. Soon, the colony depended on them. This is the first promise of this era. You will see how work became control, and how control became law. But first, we must understand the place. Manhattan was not empty land. Native people lived there. They had farms and trade paths. The Dutch wanted control of the port. New Amsterdam grew around the harbor. Ships came and left. Goods moved fast. Money followed. Yet buildings did not rise on their own. Roads did not appear by chance. The labor had to come from somewhere. Free workers were rare. European settlers wanted land, not hard labor. Indentured servants came, but many left once free. Enslaved Africans did not leave. That fact shaped the city. The Dutch West India Company used enslaved labor for public works. They built Fort Amsterdam. They worked on docks. They cut timber. They carried stone. Without this labor, the port could not grow. Soon you will see how slavery moved from company control into private hands. And when that happened, the city changed again. By the 1630s, the number of enslaved Africans grew. Some came from Brazil, some came from the Caribbean, some came directly from Africa. Their names were written in records, but their voices were not. They lived near the fort. They lived near farms. They lived close to the work they did. The Dutch had laws about slavery. These laws were not kind, but they were specific. Enslaved people could marry. They could be baptized. They could speak Dutch. They could testify in court in some cases. This may sound soft. It was not. They were still owned. They could be sold. They could be punished. Their children were enslaved. Yet this system allowed one rare thing. In 1644, a group of enslaved men made a bold request. They asked for freedom. They did not ask in anger. They asked in writing. The men were granted half freedom. They could live on their own land. They could work for wages, but they had duties. They had to pay yearly fees. They had to work for the company when called. Their children remained enslaved. This system was not freedom. It was control with a softer hand. Why did the company agree? Because it needed stability. Because it needed workers close by. Because fear was feared. Now you see the pattern. Economy shaped law. Fear shaped policy. As New Amsterdam grew, private farms expanded. So did households. Enslaved Africans moved from company work to private ownership. Merchants bought them, farmers bought them. Skilled workers were trained. Some enslaved men became carpenters, some became blacksmiths, some worked in bakeries. Women cooked, they cleaned, they raised children, they made daily life possible. This labor saved money, it raised profits, it increased trade. New York's economy did not grow beside slavery, it grew through slavery. This is not opinion, it is record. Tax lists show enslaved people listed as property. Estate papers list them beside tools and animals. This is the moment where discomfort must sit, because the city you know today rests on this stage. And now, the ground shifts again. In 1664, the English took control. New Amsterdam became New York. The rulers changed, the system did not. The English expanded slavery. New laws were stricter, punishments were harsher, rights were fewer. Slavery spread beyond Manhattan. It reached Long Island, it reached the Hudson Valley. New York became a major slave port. Ships arrived with enslaved Africans. Ships left with grain, timber, and goods. The port thrived. You will soon see how trade tied New York to a larger system, a system that fed wealth and fed fear. By the early 1700s, 1 in 5 people in New York City was enslaved. This was one of the highest rates in the northern colonies. Enslaved people worked everywhere, in homes, on docks, in shops. They built roads, they dug wells, they carried goods through streets. They were visible, yet ignored. Markets sold them openly. One stood near today's Wall Street. That detail matters. Money and bondage stood side by side. And this leads us to the emotional core of this time. Because when people are treated as tools, pressure grows, and pressure always seeks release. By the early 1700s, fear filled the city. Enslaved people were watched closely. Laws tightened, curfews were set. Why? Because resistance was feared. The economy depended on control. Control depended on force, and force carries risk. By the late 1600s, New York was no longer a fragile settlement. It was a growing port city. Ships arrived each week, goods moved faster, money flowed deeper. But this growth rested on a weak balance. Enslaved labor held the city together. Fear held that labor in place. The English rulers understood this clearly. They did not invent slavery in New York. They expanded it. They hardened it. They wrote fear into law. This is where the story turns darker, and it turns slowly. Under English rule, slavery became more defined. Laws were passed to remove uncertainty. These laws did not protect enslaved people. They protected property. In 1682, New York passed rules limiting movement. Enslaved Africans could not gather freely. They could not leave their homes at night without permission. Punishment followed quickly. Whipping was common. Public punishment was encouraged. It sent a message. The message was simple. Order must be kept. The economy demanded it. As the number of enslaved people increased, anxiety grew among white residents. By 1700, enslaved Africans made up a large part of the city's workforce. They worked side by side. They shared language. They shared pain. Authorities noticed this. They worried about unity, so they acted. In 1702, New York passed a slave code. It restricted gatherings. It restricted trade by enslaved people. It increased penalties for resistance. Testimony from enslaved people against white people was limited, but testimony against other enslaved people was allowed. This detail mattered. It turned fear inward. It broke trust. And this brings us to a truth often missed. Control was not only physical, it was social. Now we move closer to the edge. The early 1700s brought tension. The city grew crowded. Food prices rose. Jobs were tight. Poor white workers competed with enslaved labor. Resentment grew. Enslaved people were blamed for theft. They were blamed for fires. They were blamed for unrest. Rumors spread fast. The economy was strong. The social peace was not. In April 1712, a fire broke out on Maiden Lane. It was not a large fire, but it burned deep into the city's mind. During the confusion, a group of enslaved Africans fought back. Several white residents were killed. Some were injured. The event shocked New York. It was small in scale. It was massive in response. Authorities reacted with force. More than 70 enslaved people were arrested. Trials were rushed. Evidence was thin. Executions followed. Some were hanged. Some were burned alive. Some were broken on wheels. This punishment was public. Crowds were encouraged. The message was sent again. Fear would be met with terror. This moment changed everything, but not in the way rulers expected. After 1712, laws tightened further. Night curfews were enforced. Meetings were banned. Rewards were offered for information. Freedom narrowed. The city tried to control thought through force. Yet something else happened. The economy continued to depend on enslaved labor. Merchants needed workers. Homes needed servants. Docks needed hands. This contradiction mattered. The city punished enslaved people, then demanded their work. This tension never resolved, and it never rested. Now we move forward. By the 1720s, New York's role in the Atlantic trade expanded. The city did not only use enslaved labor, it supported the trade itself. Ships were built in New York. They sailed to Africa. They carried goods. They returned with enslaved Africans. Other ships carried food to Caribbean plantations. These plantations produced sugar and rum. That rum returned to New York. It was sold. It was taxed. It enriched merchants. This network fed the city's economy. Slavery was not distant. It was central. Churches baptized enslaved people, but baptism did not mean freedom. Owners feared loss of control. Laws clarified that baptism changed nothing. This fact is painful. It shows intent. Religion did not weaken slavery in New York. It adjusted to it. Some enslaved people gained skills. They hired themselves out. They paid part of earnings to owners. This system increased profit. Owners liked it. Enslaved people saw brief hope. But hope carried limits. Freedom remained rare. Now the pressure builds again. In 1741, fear returned with force. A series of fires broke out in the city. Homes burned. Warehouses burned. No proof tied these fires together, but rumor did the work. People whispered of plots. They whispered of rebellion. The city panicked. Investigations began. Testimony was forced. Stories changed. More than 100 people were arrested. Many were enslaved Africans. Some were poor white residents. Trials followed the pattern of fear. Executions followed quickly. 13 enslaved people were burned alive. Others were hanged. Some were transported out of the colony. This event left scars. Historians still debate the truth of the accusations. What is clear is the response. Fear ruled, and the economy demanded calm at any cost. After 1741, New York did not abandon slavery. It protected it harder. Surveillance increased. Laws stayed harsh. Yet whispers of change began. Not freedom yet, just doubt. Some questioned the cruelty. Some questioned the risk. But profit answered louder. Slavery continued. By the mid-1700s, New York stood at a crossroads. Its wealth grew. Its fear deepened. Enslaved labor built homes. It built streets. It built trade networks. The city could not imagine itself without this system. Yet unrest never disappeared. Every law promised order. Every punishment promised peace. None delivered it. By the middle of the 1700s, slavery in New York was no longer new. It was ordinary. That fact made it powerful. Enslaved Africans were woven into daily life. They were in kitchens at dawn. They were on docks before sunrise. They were in workshops as tools warmed. The city woke because they woke first. This matters, because when a system becomes normal, it stops being questioned. And yet, inside that normal life, something stirred. But first, you must see the work clearly. New York's economy depended on variety. It was not a plantation colony. It was a city colony. Enslaved people worked in many roles. Men carried cargo from ships. They hauled barrels of flour. They moved lumber from yards. They worked as sailors on coastal ships. Some were skilled craftsmen. They shaped wood. They repaired tools. They built furniture. Women labored inside homes. They cooked meals. They washed clothes. They raised children who were not their own. Some sold goods in markets with permission. Some baked bread. Some brewed drinks. This labor saved time. It saved money. It built profit. New York merchants grew wealthy through this system. Records from the time show clear patterns. Estate inventories listed enslaved people by age and skill. A strong dock worker carried high value. A skilled carpenter brought more. Children were listed too. They were counted as future labor. This truth is hard. It must be faced calmly. The economy measured people by output. Banks did not yet exist as you know them, but credit did. Enslaved people were used as security for loans. They backed business deals. They supported trade expansion. This tied slavery directly to growth, not indirectly, directly. Enslaved people lived close to white households. This closeness created tension. They heard conversations. They watched decisions. They learned habits. Owners feared this awareness. So, control expanded into behavior. Dress codes were enforced. Movement was watched. Speech was monitored. Enslaved people needed passes to travel. Curfews limited time outside. Punishment remained public. The goal was clear. Keep work flowing. Keep fear visible. Yet, daily contact created cracks. Some enslaved people learned to read. Some learned trades. Some earned small wages. These moments mattered. They did not break the system, but they tested it. And testing creates strain. Religion played a complex role. Churches grew across the city. They baptized enslaved people. They preached obedience. But sermons also spoke of moral order. They spoke of justice. Enslaved listeners heard both messages. Some formed their own prayer meetings, quiet ones, hidden ones. These meetings built community. They shared news. They shared grief. They shared hope. This was not rebellion. It was survival. And survival is resistance when freedom is denied. Now we move deeper. Families among the enslaved were fragile. Sales broke them apart. Death separated them. Yet bonds formed. Marriage ceremonies took place. Children were named with care. Parents taught memory. They taught stories. They taught rules for staying alive. This cultural life mattered. It carried strength. Owners underestimated it. They saw labor. They missed humanity. This gap created misunderstanding, and misunderstanding breeds fear. By the 1760s, ideas were shifting. The city heard talk of rights, talk of liberty, talk of power. These ideas did not belong only to elites. Enslaved people heard them too. They worked in homes where newspapers were read. They carried messages. They listened. British policies tightened trade rules. Taxes increased. Merchants grew angry. Meetings were held. Speeches were made. Words such as freedom and tyranny filled rooms. Enslaved listeners noticed something. The language sounded familiar. They knew tyranny. They lived it. This connection did not go unnoticed by authorities. Fear returned. Laws were enforced harder. Movement was restricted. The system sensed danger. Yet work continued. The docks stayed busy. Shops stayed open. The economy could not pause. This contradiction deepened. Some enslaved people used the moment. They ran away. They sought refuge with native groups. They hid in rural areas. Advertisements filled newspapers. Descriptions were detailed. Rewards were offered. These ads tell stories. They describe skills. They describe scars. They describe clothing. They show individuality. Each ad is a quiet voice. It says this person chose risk. That choice mattered. Not all resistance involved escape. Some slowed work. Some broke tools. Some feigned illness. These acts were small. They were dangerous. Punishment followed if discovered. Yet they happened again and again. This tells us something important. The system demanded obedience. It never fully received it. As tensions rose between Britain and the colonies, New York stood divided. Merchants feared instability. Authorities feared uprising. Enslaved people stood at the center of that fear. Rumors spread again. Whispers of plots returned. The city remembered 1712. It remembered 1741. Fear shaped response before facts. This pattern repeated, and repetition hardens habit. By the early 1770s, the city balanced on uncertainty. Trade slowed at times. Politics grew loud. Enslaved labor remained constant. It held the city steady. Yet the cost grew heavier. Owners tightened grip. Punishments increased. But pressure builds when no release exists, and release was coming. Not in the way many expected, but in a way that would reshape everything. By the mid-1770s, New York was no longer calm. Arguments filled taverns. Pamphlets spread through streets. Meetings grew tense. The talk was about liberty. White colonists argued over rights. They argued over rule. They argued over power. But beneath these debates stood a silent question. What would happen to slavery if war came? No one agreed. When fighting began between Britain and the colonies, New York became a prize. Its port mattered. Its location mattered. Its economy mattered. Both sides wanted control. In 1776, British forces captured the city. New York became the main British base in North America. This moment changed the lives of enslaved people immediately. The rules shifted. The risks shifted. And opportunity appeared where danger lived. British leaders made a choice early in the war. They needed labor. They needed support. They needed to weaken the rebels. So they made an offer. In 1775, and again in later orders, British officials promised freedom to enslaved people who escaped rebel owners and aided the British cause. This was not a moral stand. It was a military strategy. But for enslaved people, it sounded different. It sounded like a door opening. Enslaved people began to flee toward British lines. Some walked at night. Some traveled by river. Some followed rumor. The city filled with runaways. British camps held thousands of black refugees. Men, women, and children gathered there. Life was not safe. Disease spread. Food was scarce, but many stayed, because return meant chains. This choice was not simple. British promises were uncertain. American punishment was certain. This shaped every decision. New York's economy felt the strain. Owners lost labor. Work slowed. Households struggled. Advertisements filled newspapers seeking runaways. The language grew sharper. Rewards grew higher. Fear returned to familiar form. Authorities worried about disorder. They worried about rebellion. Yet the British needed these people. They put them to work. Black refugees labored for the British Army. They built fortifications. They repaired roads. They cooked meals. They cleaned camps. Some served as guides. Some served as messengers. Their work mattered. The British relied on them. Yet protection remained fragile. Freedom was promised, but paperwork was rare. Trust was thin. The city suffered during occupation. Fires destroyed parts of Manhattan. Food shortages grew. Prices rose. Poor residents struggled. Enslaved labor still existed in loyalist homes. Some owners kept control. Some lost it. The system fractured, not ended, fractured. And fracture creates uncertainty. American leaders watched this with alarm. They feared the loss of labor. They feared British influence. Some responded with threats, some with laws. But control weakened. War does that. For enslaved people, chaos created space. Small space, dangerous space, but space nonetheless. Not all enslaved people fled to the British. Some stayed. Some feared betrayal. Some feared disease. Some feared violence. Others saw opportunity elsewhere. They joined American forces. A few colonies allowed limited service. Promises varied. Freedom was not guaranteed. The war forced choices with no safe answer. This truth must be held. There was no clear path. By the early 1780s, the war neared its end. British defeat became clear. Now fear changed sides. Black refugees feared abandonment. They feared return to slavery. British officers faced pressure. American negotiators demanded property return. They included enslaved people in that demand. This detail matters. It shows how slavery remained embedded. British commanders made a decision. They would evacuate New York. They would leave. But what about the black people who followed them? This moment tested British promises. Some officers kept records. They created a document. It listed names of black people leaving the city. It noted former owners. It noted status. This record became known as the Book of Negroes. It mattered deeply. Those listed were allowed to leave. Many sailed to Nova Scotia. Some later went to Sierra Leone. Freedom was harsh. Life was difficult. But chains were broken. Not for all. For some. When American rule returned to New York after the war, the city faced a problem it could not ignore. Freedom had been spoken. Promises had been made. Thousands had acted on those promises. Yet slavery remained legal. The city did not collapse from this conflict. It adjusted. That adjustment tells us everything. New York's leaders understood one truth clearly. The economy needed labor. Homes needed servants. Docks needed workers. Shops needed hands. Replacing enslaved labor would cost money. Free labor demanded wages. Profit mattered more than speed, so change was delayed, not denied, delayed. This delay shaped the next decades. In 1785, a group of white citizens formed the New York Manumission Society. Some were merchants, some were lawyers, some were politicians. They spoke against slavery. They called it wrong. They called it dangerous. This sounds hopeful, but action moved slowly. The society focused first on protecting free black people from kidnapping. It helped some enslaved people gain freedom through legal means. These efforts mattered, but they were limited. They did not threaten the system itself. Schools for black children opened with support from the society. Education was offered, but opportunity remained narrow. Free black residents faced limits. They could not vote. They could not hold many jobs. They faced constant risk of capture. Freedom existed. Equality did not. This distinction mattered deeply. In 1799, New York passed a law for gradual emancipation. This law did not free enslaved adults. Children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th of that year were declared free, but not fully. They were bound to serve owners for years, men until age 28, women until age 25. This was freedom postponed. The law sounded generous. Its effect was slow. This was by design. Owners kept labor. The economy stayed steady. Change arrived on paper first. Many enslaved people lived out their lives in bondage under this law. They would never reach the date of release. Their children would, but childhood itself became labor. This created a new system, not slavery by name, but slavery by structure. Work continued. Control remained. The city accepted this compromise. By the early 1800s, New York's economy expanded again. Trade increased. Shipping grew. Banking took shape. Slavery became less central to large profits, but it still mattered at home. Household slavery remained common. Enslaved women worked in kitchens. Men worked in stables and shops. This form of slavery felt quieter. That made it easier to ignore. Free black communities grew. They built churches. They built mutual aid groups. They supported each other. Yet danger stayed close. Kidnappers operated openly. Courts favored white testimony. Freedom required constant defense. This pressure shaped daily life, and it built resolve. In 1817, New York passed another law. It declared that slavery would end in the state by July 4, 1827. This date mattered. It gave owners time. It gave the economy time. It gave politicians cover. The promise was clear. The wait was long. Enslaved people waited. Some were freed early. Some were not. Owners delayed release. Courts were slow. The law allowed it. Freedom approached, but not evenly. The city moved forward with one foot tied. As the final date neared, fear returned. Owners worried about labor loss. Workers worried about competition. Free black people worried about safety. The city prepared, not for justice, for order. On July 4, 1827, slavery legally ended in New York. No celebration filled the streets. Work continued. Life continued. But something had changed. Ownership ended. The economy survived. This truth mattered. It showed that delay had not been necessary, but delay had been chosen. When slavery ended in New York in 1827, the system did not vanish. It loosened its grip. It changed its form. The city moved forward, but it carried its past. That past shaped streets, wealth, and power, and it shaped lives. Formerly enslaved people stepped into freedom without protection. They owned little. They were owed nothing. No land was given. No payment was offered. Work was available, but wages were low. Housing was crowded. Jobs were unstable. Freedom arrived without security. This detail matters, because freedom without support creates struggle, and struggle shapes the future. Many black New Yorkers found work as laborers. They worked on docks. They worked in construction. They worked as servants. The same work continued. The status changed. Pay replaced ownership. Control softened but did not disappear. Employers set terms. Courts favored property owners. Opportunity stayed narrow. This pattern repeated. White workers competed for the same jobs. Black workers were blamed for low wages. They were blamed for scarcity. This blame ignored history. It ignored unpaid labor. It ignored generations of profit built on bondage. But blame is easier than truth. Wealth in New York remained uneven. Families who had owned enslaved people retained advantage. They owned land. They owned businesses. Their capital grew. Black families began with none of this. This gap widened over time, not by accident, by inheritance. Banks and merchants expanded. Shipping grew. Industry increased. The profits from earlier decades funded new ventures. Those profits had roots in unpaid labor. This connection was rarely spoken, but it mattered. It allowed some to rise faster. It forced others to climb without tools. Black communities organized. Churches became centers of support. Mutual aid societies formed. They helped with burials. They helped with sickness. They shared food. They shared news. These communities filled gaps left by the state. This was resilience. It was learned through survival. Education remained limited. Schools existed. Resources did not. Many children worked young. Families needed income. The cycle continued. Work replaced schooling. Poverty replaced choice. This was not destiny, it was structure. The city grew fast. Immigrants arrived from Europe. Neighborhoods shifted. Black New Yorkers were pushed into tighter spaces. Housing discrimination grew. Landlords set higher rents. Services declined. Segregation formed without law. It formed through practice. Memory of slavery faded in public speech. Monuments honored merchants and leaders, not laborers. History books focused on trade and growth. They skipped bondage. Silence replaced acknowledgement. This silence mattered. It allowed myths to grow. It allowed responsibility to fade. Yet memory lived elsewhere, in families, in stories, in warning passed to children. Stay alert. Trust carefully. These lessons came from experience. They were not written, they were lived. New York celebrated progress. It celebrated expansion. It celebrated wealth. But beneath celebration lay imbalance. The city moved forward on uneven ground. Slavery had shaped that ground, and it had not been leveled. Slavery's end did not erase its effects. It set them into motion. Economic patterns persisted. Social barriers remained. The past did not vanish. It adapted.